Okay, let's just state the obvious before we continue with this video. In the North, back in the day, it was controlled by the Republicans, and in the South, it was controlled by the Democrats. The South is and has always been conservative. Guess what? You look at a modern map, they switched. Yes, they switched. It took a long time, but if you want to find out how that happened, stick around. Welcome to Real with O'Neil.
It's real.
So when I mean party switch, I'm actually talking about more of a ideological realignment between the two parties. So you got to understand that this is a different time than what it is today, and the parties were different from what it is today. So conservatives in the South were very states' rights, but even conservatism in itself wasn't really the same. It still has more alignment with the conservative South as today, but you got to understand that politics have changed. The Republicans, for instance, back in the day, they were really the party of big business, which they still are, but they were also very lenient with expansion of federal funding as long as it helped the markets. So that's kind of where the change between the South and the North came, and that's why the Republicans were there. Now think about the Republicans back in the day in the Civil War. So in the North, it was more industrialized than the South. In the South, it was more agrarian. So whenever the Civil War happened, yes, it was about slavery, but it wasn't about the morally righteous Republicans. That's not how it works. They wanted to keep the Union together. That's the biggest thing that they wanted to do. And on top of that, they need to industrialize the South because they didn't want to have solely an agrarian economy. So you got to understand as well that the moral righteousness of the two parties isn't very true. It's politics. They're going to do whatever they want to do to get the votes. So, like I stated, the Democrats in the South were conservative. And this is where people don't understand about the party alignment deal. It's not about the parties, it's about their ideologies. The Democrats back in the day were racist conservatives. The South is still conservative. The North was socially progressive, big business industrialists. That's the difference. Now, here's the thing. The change didn't really happen. It started with the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, but you wouldn't start seeing black voters start coming to the Democrats, or even the Democrats going more towards social and, yeah, honestly, socialism, more social expansion of federal powers and things like that, and away from a conservative ideology. And that's where the splits were happening. But it started in 1933 when FDR put into place the New Deal. What is the New Deal? It's essentially a package of went from 1933 to 1936. There was a social package. Of course, this is when the Great Depression, guys. Don't let people lie to you and state that they did the New Deal solely to get black and liberal votes. That's not the only reason why they did it. They did it because during the Depression, because the New Deal in the beginning was very bipartisan. But after a while, it started getting a lot of opposition from laissez-faire, free market Republicans, and then conservative Southern Democrats. And so that's where that change is happening. And of course, it happened in 1936 is where you're starting to see more black voters go over to the Democratic Party. And let me tell you something, they did it hesitantly because they understood that the Democrats, of course, were the party of slavery. And a lot of conservatives still controlled the Democrats. However, this was the first time that there was a very distinct change within the Democratic Party because, of course, Northern Democrats were a little bit more socially progressive than the Deep South conservatives in the Democratic Party. And so this is when you're starting to see the change in the Democrats. Honestly, you start seeing more change in the Democratic Party first before you see the Republicans. And let me just reiterate this again. The parties of today are the politics of today are extremely different than it was back in the day. Now it's a lot more partisan. We are looking at the most partisan political parties that we've ever seen in the history of America. Back in the day, the Republicans had left and right-wing politicians, and same with the Democrats. It just depended on where you were. So there was a lot of infighting in both parties, but especially in the Democrats. But check out the New Deal. Poverty, unemployment, dangerous labor conditions, and the struggling agricultural sector were now to be addressed through government reform and relief programs. Not surprisingly, though, the idea did not gain much popularity among those who promoted limited government intervention, laissez-faire, and individualism. Among them, business leaders, Republicans, and conservative Democrats constituted the most powerful group of the New Deal's opponents. All right, so this was hugely important. What did the New Deal essentially do politically? One, it started to migrate the black voter over to the Democrats, and two, they started to shed a little bit of their conservative ideology. This is where the big change is happening, specifically in the Democratic Party. So why did the Democrats want to, or excuse me, why did the black voters want to go over to the Democrats when the Democrats were historically the party of slavery and the party of conservatism? Well, the reason why is because, and this is going to be a problem that the Republicans have in the next couple of decades, is that they were slow to back a lot of social programs and civil rights act, or excuse me, civil rights legislation that directly benefited the black community. So black people had to think. The black voter had to look at it at a logical understanding of what's going on in the political climate and what they're doing. I mean, the Great Depression greatly affected the black voter. I mean, at the time, it was like 40% unemployment for the black voter. So they knew that this, and it happened in 1933, and they saw that it was working and it was helping getting them jobs, allowing them to be under social programs so they can actually benefit their families. And so they had to make a decision. So a lot of them started to go over to the Democrats. Now, right now, it's still about 50-50. It's not everyone's Republican. And like I stated, the parties both had conservatives and both had socially progressive Republicans and Democrats. But the New Deal essentially created a environment where the Democrats now are about to split between socially progressive Northern Democrats and then conservative Southern Democrats. And it happened in 1948 with the creation of the Dixiecrats. We all know about the Dixiecrats, the very racist and very conservative Democrats headed by Strom Thurmond. And what that did is essentially, it began the change of the Democratic Party. And it began to show that black voting and black voters started to become at the forefront of the policies at both parties needed to actually pay attention to gain voters, not only from black people, but from progressives and liberals. And so what Strom Thurmond did was bring about a bunch of fucking racists and essentially ran against Truman and the Republican. I forgot who he was. Dewey or something. But check out this map. This shows how the change in the Democrats lost the solid South because of the Dixiecrats. So look at the map. All right, so after looking at the map, you might be asking, okay, O'Neill, why did the Dixiecrats break off from the Democrats? Well, I'll tell you why. The Trump administration's policies solidified black support for the Democrats. In 1948, Truman sent a package of civil rights measures to Congress, including a compulsory FEPC, an anti-poll tax and anti-lynching legislation, a commission to investigate racial issues, and a bill to end discrimination in interstate transportation, which a Republican-controlled Congress did not pass. Later in 1948, he issued an executive order desegregating the military. And I know what the conservatives are saying right now. Well, historically speaking, the Dixiecrats stayed with the Democrats and only Strom Thurmond went over to the Republicans. Yeah, no shit. Listen, even today, it's extremely rare for politicians to switch party lines. There's still party loyalty. And on top of that, where were they supposed to go? To the Republicans? Both the Republicans and Democrats, like I stated, both had progressives, socially progressive Republicans and Democrats, and both had conservatives. So the Dixiecrats weren't going to go over to the Republicans. It wouldn't have made any difference. That's the problem with this whole argument, this whole conversation, is because people are trying to put modern politics on politics back 50 years to 60 years ago. That doesn't make any sense. They were changing. They had conservatives and progressives on both sides. But don't get it twisted, y'all. I am not saying that President Truman was a saint. Hell, I'm not saying any of these presidents on the Democratic side were a saint. A lot of them were very fucking racist. Truman was a racist, LBJ was a racist, but Republicans had racists too. Here's the thing, the black voter were stuck between a rock and a hard place. They either had to go with the Republicans that did nothing for them, didn't even want to do anything for them, or are very slow on civil rights, or they went with the Democrats, which there were still a lot of racists and conservatives that are super racist, but the Northern Dems were still pushing social programs that were helping black voters. So they didn't know what to do. Look back at the actually, I'm gonna show this map. It shows that after a while, in 36 you see the change, in 48 you see a change, but I want to show you something else as well. Look at 52 and 56. Look how they changed. This is where, in my own opinion, the last chance that the Republicans had to actually garner more black votes. And it was with, in my own opinion, the greatest Republican president of all time, and that man is General Eisenhower. That dude actually gave a fuck about black people that we know of. Obviously, historically speaking, you'll see. But at the same time, he was the only Republican that I saw that when I was doing my research that actually, went into Harlem. That he went to predominant black cities and actually talked to the people. If you look at it, you've seen that there was back to the map. Look at the map again. In 52, 56, you see, and it dips down a little bit. You see that, okay, more black people are starting to associate themselves with Republicans again. Hell, it was, I think, the election in 1956, he garnered, in total, 36% of the black votes. You might be thinking, that's not really a lot. I mean, today, Republicans only get like 10 to 13%. He got 36%, and in some places in the South, he got 48%. That's almost half of the black vote. So the myth that Truman was the last chance for, black voters to go over to Republicans is false. It was actually General Eisenhower. But some of the Republicans, more conservative Republicans, were rejecting the ideologies of Eisenhower. Hell, even some of the, those progressive ones that were more free marketalists, laissez-faire and things like that, big business, they stated that Eisenhower was a little bit too socially liberal for the Republican Party. And you know who actually verbatim said that? Barry Goldwater. And that guy is the reason why the Republicans do not have black voters to this day. Period. Listen, and I'm going to get back to him in a little bit, but the change is starting to happen, guys. The Democrats are now becoming a little bit more socially active. Really, they're just trying to get votes. They're not fronting. They still do the same thing. Republicans still do the same thing. They're pandering. Hell, they're politicians, y'all. And Republicans and the Democrats now, back in the day and forever in the future, are pandering to get your vote. So it is what it is. However, in 1964, as we all know, the Civil Rights Bill has been passed by LBJ. That is the final nail in the coffin for Republicans to get any kind of black voter. And the reason why the Republican Party fucked up, because they allowed Barry Goldwater to essentially, he was a moderate in a sense, but he stated that he was opposed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 because he wanted to leave it for the states to decide. Like, again, the gradual trying to, ease social justice and ease social change just at the state level wasn't enough for black people, because unfortunately, there's still a lot of conservative racists that disallowed that kind of change. So black people are like, hey, we need this change now. As you can see from the map, Barry Goldwater has taken the Deep South for the Republicans. The Democrats have lost the South, and now here on out, it's showing that the party for states' rights, big business, conservatism is now solely the Republican Party. And it's going to be exacerbated, and they're going to really take up that mantle of conservatism with the Southern strategy. This is the finalization of the conservative ideology dominating the Republican Party. And that starts with Nixon in 1970. And for those who say that the Southern strategy was not a racist attempt to dog whistle and garner votes from white conservatives, look at this video from Lee Atwater, who is a political a political strategist and the former chairman of the Republican National Convention. Look at what he says about the Southern strategy.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire, so you say stuff like force busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing. hell of a lot more abstract than nigger nigger, you know.
So, with the implementation of the Southern strategy, which it was slowly affecting the South, and we're now just seeing the finalization of the Southern strategy, in my own opinion. But we're seeing the realignment now happening in the 70s, where the Democrats are going to be home of expanding federal power, and then the Republicans are going to be more states' rights. And that's how, honestly, in my own opinion, the party realignment, which the argument stating that this is a myth because of race issues, I would say it's not necessarily just race issues. I think the switch, quote unquote, was which party was going to be home for states' rights. And at first it was Democrats because of their conservative heritage. But now that white conservatives are going over to the Republicans, that states' rights mantra is now home to the Republicans. And why did black voters not go back to the Republicans, even though Democrats were historically the party of slavery and party of racist conservatives, is because those conservatives are leaving the Democratic Party for the Republican Party because of the Southern strategy, and not necessarily because of race, but because of who is going to be the champion of states' rights, and that was the Republican Party. And that's why, y'all, whenever we talk about this switch, this realignment, it's not necessarily that saying that one party is for civil rights and one party is not. Really what that realignment was is that where were progressives and liberals and conservatives going towards? And unfortunately, conservatives, historically speaking, were racist and against civil rights. And their justification for being against civil rights was because they wanted to be left to the states. And they thought that federal power was, federal intervention was too much. It was expanding federal power. Where the Democrats embraced the expansion of federal power, which allowed for a Civil Rights Act to be passed by Democrats. And so the black voters saw that and said, "Hey, we're going to go with the Democrats because that's what's benefiting our community more specifically than what the Republicans were trying to implement." So, guys, in summary, man, the realignment, the myth that it didn't exist is obviously not true. If you look at where conservatives are today and where they were 80 years ago, it's obvious that the party switch. And I would say that even the switch was not necessarily politicians, it was the people. The conservatives were the ones who switched. It wasn't necessarily the black voters. The black voters just went to where they were benefiting them the most. I mean, I guess you could say the same thing for conservatives, but unfortunately, those racist conservatives went to the Republican Party. Am I saying all Republicans are racist? No. Am I saying all conservatives are racist? No. Am I saying all Southerners are racist? No. But here's the thing. Those racist conservative Southerners went over to the Republican Party. And that's where that realignment went. And just so we can just kind of bite it in the bud, the KKK, yes, they started as Democrats. But guess what? They now are Republicans. Actually, there's a quote directly from the KKK stating that they are now home to the Republican Party. Look at this. All right, so this is where I think the Republicans fucked up putting Barry Goldwater as their face of conservatism. So look at this. In an ad that was produced but never aired, the Ku Klux Klan leader with a burning cross and hooded figures filled the screen is quoted as denouncing niggerism, Catholicism, Judaism, all the isms, and in the same breath saying, "I like Barry Goldwater, he needs our help." So the myth that the KKK were I've heard someone say they are far left Democrats makes no sense. They are literally a far right conservative group. They've been a far right conservative group since they were created. Why? Because this is the problem. We need to stop talking about Democrats and Republicans. Those are just political parties, guys. They can change. Their ideologies change all the time. I'm talking about conservatives and liberals, and the KKK were conservatives. The Deep South, Civil War, Confederacy they were conservatives. I mean, it's funny. It's actually hypocritical because I see a lot of Trump supporters waving around the Confederate flag saying that it's our heritage, but at the same tone will say, "Oh, but they were Democrats." Then they're not your heritage, supposedly, but you know that they were conservative. So I don't want to hear about the Democratic Party. I don't want to hear about the Republican Party. I want to hear about the ideologies and what these people actually believed in. So there was a realignment. In summary, guys, it took over 3 decades. And I'm not saying the Democrats, like I stated, have the moral high ground here. They were doing everything just to get votes, and they saw an opportunity to expand federal power and garner votes from minorities and liberals and progressives. They kind of do the same thing now, but I would say that they're changing because of the people. We're seeing more black, Hispanic, and everything like that within the Democratic Party. Is there probably old white people that are still in the Democratic Party that are racist? Probably, and I hope they die, because the next generation of Democrats are going to be black and brown, Jewish, Muslim. They're going to be more variety. They're going to look more like the American population, the American demographic. The problem with the Republicans is they just can't. They haven't been able to get out of it because they've married their party with the ideology of conservatism. And when I say that the Southern strategy is now actually coming to fruition, is because of Donald Trump. He has essentially exploited the conservative ideology and now has made it into Trumpism is conservatism. And that's where the GOP is right now. So the realignment took over 3 to 4 decades to actually happen. And now our parties are more partisan than they ever have before. And like I stated earlier in the video, back in the day, they weren't as partisan. There were conservatives and progressives on both sides of the aisle. So guys, I appreciate y'all watching. I would love to see, all my sources going to be in the caption like they always are. I would love to hear an expanded discussion on this. Trump supporters, I would love for you to comment below. Don't be assholes, but explain your side of the story. Why you still think there wasn't a realignment when, of course, you just look at an electoral map in the past 5 or 6 elections, they changed. Because they're supposed to change. That's how politics works. Because the demographics of the United States is changing. That change will now become a change within the political parties. Realignment existed. It happened. The switch happened in different ways, not just race issues. This is Real with O'Neal. You can catch me at Real with O'Neal on all my social media, realwithoneal.com. I have a new website. All my content is going to be on there. I appreciate y'all. I'll catch y'all next week.
It's real.